Hello, I'm Glenn with ACJI, and you're about ready to see a webinar version and a high-level summary of the 10 essential principles of implementation leadership. And before we get into content today, I want to share a little bit of information with you about where implementation leadership comes from and a little bit about what it means to me. I'm in my 33rd year in the criminal justice system here in Colorado, and most of that time has been spent as a change agent at some level or another and leading change at some level or another. And about 10 years ago, we decided to start using implementation science to advance our evidence-based practice initiatives. Prior to using implementation science, we had just been kind of training evidence-based practice and weren't getting really good outcomes. So we decided to up our game and start using implementation science, and the way that I learn is that I write things down. It's just the way that I retain information in my brain, and it works for me. So I got a journal and started documenting all of my experiences with using implementation science so that I could learn and maybe someday go back and harvest what I learned. So after about 10 years of doing that, I got to the end of my journal and I ran out of paper, ran out of pages, and decided to start another one because the work had not been done. And as I opened the new journal and was ready to start writing down, I had this reflection that I need to start looking back into the past and harvest what I had learned from all those trials and all the learning from using the implementation science applications. So I started taking notes from my notes and harvesting themes from a 250-page journal where I had just fairly random information. What emerged from those themes were these 10 essential principles. These are academically supported but practically derived. So that means they're good science-based principles, yet they're based in the real world. Because the real world of organizational change is really hard. It's arduous, it's wrought with problems, it's tough. Human change is hard, and organizational change, I believe, is even harder. And quite honestly, in the criminal justice system, we're not that good at change. So the 10 essential principles are intended to give you a vehicle, a new mindset, and a new vocabulary so that you can lead change in your organization with these 10 principles. I think you're going to enjoy the content, and I hope that you do, and I hope this helps you with your work. I want to start with the idea that organizations and systems are perfectly designed to achieve the outcomes that we get. Just think about that for a second, and you can think about it a couple ways. If you take a look at your outcomes, those are perfect reflections or perfect shadows of what's happening in your organization. And that's not limited to just your practices or just your habits. Another way you can think about it is that whatever's happening in your organization at the cultural level, at the leadership level, the way that we implement, and our habits and our practices is perfectly driving our results. Harvard has reported that change, generally speaking, fails at a very high rate. Theory E type of change we can call that top-down. Harvard's reported that 70% of those top-down change initiatives fail. And those type of methods are pretty familiar to us in the community and justice system. Those are where the executive director or the legislature or somebody else kind of imposes change from the top down. Maybe they go to a conference or they get excited about some kind of change initiative and they try to implement it in the way that we traditionally implement change, which is a top-down method. And those have pretty high failure rates at 70% or better. Theory O type of change has the same failure rate of about 70%. And Theory O, or bottom-up, is, you can kind of think of that of like grassroots change initiatives. Say, for example, a staff or a team goes to a conference and they get excited about some kind of a new program and they try to implement change at the grassroots or bottom-up level. And those type of initiatives also have high failure rates, better than 2/3. And by extension of that, we know that about 2/3 or better of critical mass change initiatives fail. And those type of initiatives are when we try to train enough people in an organization on a certain thing, and we try to tip the scales by getting critical mass in our organizations and trying to train enough people, or maybe we do a training the trainers so that we implement the new innovation or the new evidence-based practice to full scale. Well, sadly, those also have high rates of failure. And I believe it's because of the way that we implement change, as well as some other factors in the domains of leadership and culture. So if you take a look at the screen for a second, you'll see these two gentlemen talking, and there's some gobbledygook science to the left, and that kind of represents our innovation or the research. And there's some gobbledygook science to the right, and that represents our outcomes or our results. And then in the middle of those, we're expecting a miracle to happen. And that miracle is essentially the way that we implement change. That miracle also reflects on how we lead change in our organizations. So the idea is that we have to be more specific here in step 2. we have to be strategic about the way that we implement change and the way that we lead change. And we typically take these two-step or traditional implementation methods. Method number one, we'll just call persuade and repeat. And you can imagine when the executive director or the change leader or the top of the organization learns about a new change initiative and they come back to the organization and really try to persuade other people with good transformational leadership and persuasion, and try to maybe even incentivize change with persuasion. And they continue to repeat that cycle over and over again. And maybe the change initiative fails and they try it again and again. And those two-step methods are what lead to our 70% failure rate. Perhaps the most common method that we see is what we'll call train and pray, another two-step method. And you've seen that where we're expecting others to change, so we put them in a class for a couple days. We maybe even give them a booster training 6 months later, and we pray that they implement the new thing. And then we find out over and over again that they forget what they learned in class and they don't apply what they learned in class. And that's because our two-step method of train and pray doesn't work. Training in and of itself does not affect outcomes. In fact, it has a very low rate of success when it comes to change. The third two-step method is policy and procedure. And maybe this is when we get real serious about change, so serious that we decide to put it in our agency policy and procedure, or we put it into maybe staff performance evaluations, or we send out instructional memos that take the form of policy and procedure, or we put it in our administrative regulations because we're very serious about the change. Sorry to say that those have very high rates of failure as well. And these traditional two-step methods, we have to think well beyond these because these are what we typically do in the community and justice system, and none of these methods in and of themselves work. When I reported to you that 70% of change initiatives fail, that number is unfortunately pretty generous for the community and justice system. When we look to the implementation science research, we see that about 14% of scientific discoveries enter day-to-day practice. That's even a higher failure rate than what Harvard reports. And that's because we're looking into the implementation science, which has deeper analysis and deeper studies of how change is implemented. So we have to have good implementation science approaches to our innovations. We can think of these gaps in our organizations and in our systems that we have to close. And the first of those gaps is what we'll call the science to service gap. And this is essentially a gap where what we do is maybe misaligned with what the science says of what we should do. In the criminal justice system, we might call that evidence-based practice, for example. And to close that gap so that what we do, our services, is guided by the science or the research. So that gap is closed simply with criminology solutions or evidence-based practice solutions or promising practice solutions, those types of things. Well, a bigger gap is the implementation gap. And the implementation gap is what we're doing. Are we doing it with fidelity, and is it producing the outcomes because of three essential components? Number one, quality. The evidence-based practice or the innovation has to be done the way that it's intended. That's adherent to the way that the model is. But that's not enough. Time is also important as well. We have to do the innovation for long enough to be able to expect an outcome. And density is also important. Density is, are we using it on a large enough scale? Are we using it with enough clients? Are we using it in enough sites? Are we using it in enough situations in order to tip the scales of change? From an implementation perspective, if we're not doing the evidence-based practice with the right quality and for long enough time and with the right density or in the right scale, then we can expect good outcomes to happen. And one of those is insufficient, or just two of those three is insufficient. You have to have all three from an implementation perspective to be able to expect organizational change to happen. So when we look at implementation level fidelity, we're looking for those three things: quality, time, and density, and all three have to coexist. The bigger gap, and maybe the invisible one, is the leadership and culture gap. And that's the way that we lead change in our organizations, and that's the way that our organizations are arranged, culturally speaking. So the talk that we're going to do today is about how we lead change. Implementation leadership is intended to close the leadership and culture gap so that we lead change, so that we can use good implementation science strategies to close the implementation gap, so that we can use good evidence-based practice to close the science to service gap. So I want to talk about the leadership component. Typical leadership schools or typical leadership education leads us to believe that real-world leadership looks like this. You can see this arrow and there's a person out in front and everybody's following that person in order and they're standing at attention and it's neat and it's orderly and it's linear and it's symmetrical. Sadly, in the real world of the community and justice system, that's just not real. The real world of leadership is arduous and full of problems and full of frustrations and full of curveballs, and we're not taught that in traditional leadership school. Real world leadership feels like this. Real world leadership in implementation is arduous. It's messy, it's wrought with problems, it's full of frustrations, it's full of curveballs, and we're not taught that in traditional leadership schools. So implementation leadership is based on more than a decade of applying implementation science to real-world organizations and real-world situations based on real-world properties of leadership. Because we need to be able to deal with the frustrating and arduous aspects of organizational change. So you may have noticed at the beginning of the webinar, and we've used the image of the butterfly as a metaphor for change. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is, and it might not be for the reasons that you think. You know, the butterfly is a bit of a cliche and symbolic of metamorphosis and change to many people, and some people even might tattoo it on their body when they go through a major life change or some kind of a transformation or metamorphosis. And the butterfly is a great example of change because it's inside-out transformation and it's an evolution from a less evolved insect to something that's much more beautiful and much more evolved and much more sophisticated. But that's not the reason that I believe the butterfly is a great metaphor for organizational change and for implementation. I use the butterfly because of what happens inside the cocoon. Now, if you look at the image on your screen, you'll see this linear change process for the butterfly metamorphosis. And this caterpillar goes into these stages and goes into the chrysalis or the cocoon, and it changes for a while, maybe takes a nap, and it comes out more evolved, and then everything's great. And nothing could be further from the truth in the real world of organizational change. What happens in the real world is when that caterpillar goes into that cocoon or the chrysalis, they actually change at the biochemical level, at the cellular level. They go into this cocoon and they're broken down into this gelatinous mass. It's kind of like a goo, and it's actually changing the insect at the cellular level, inside out change. And that's where the change really starts happening. And I'm guessing if you asked that caterpillar, what was it like inside the cocoon? He probably did not say it was neat and orderly and linear and glamorous and fun. And it was full of pain and problems. But we can't see it because that cocoon is closed, and that's where the change is happening. So I want to open up that cocoon with implementation leadership and reveal to you what the real world of leadership is like in implementation situations, because that's our real world. And so the butterfly is the metaphor for change because the butterfly gets into that stage and withholds in that stage and manifests itself in that change and suffers for a while before it can get through the change. And if the butterfly does not survive that transformation process, it does not ever turn into a butterfly. So when you look inside that cocoon, the 10 principles of implementation leadership are what happens inside the cocoon, because it's not neat and it's not pretty. And we're going to talk about 10 principles that drive real world change. A lot of change happens when people get through that cocoon zone. A lot of change fails when people can't get through that cocoon zone. So that's what we're going to be talking about in implementation leadership. And that's why I like to use the butterfly as the perfect metaphor for change. So we're going to talk about the 10 essential principles of implementation leadership. And these 10 principles are driven from the real world. Principle 1, trust the vision. Principle number 2, Murphy hates us. Principle number 3, be comfortable being uncomfortable. Principle 4, adapt or die. Principle 5, fail forward and fail often. So think back to that butterfly for a second and imagine that butterfly not following these basic concepts. Principle 6, culture is king. Principle 7, we need to lead the hearts and lead the minds. Principle number 8, intentionally infinite. Principle number 9, take the leap. And principle number 10, save the journey. We're going to talk about each of these 10 principles at a fairly high level, but we are going to go deeper into some so that you can lead change in a better way. Principle 1, trusting the vision. When you think about this principle for a second, focus on the word trust. The vision part is pretty easy to understand because we hear about that a lot in leadership school, but I want to really focus on the word trust. And we're going to talk about this phenomenon of the emotional contagion, which essentially is the idea that as human beings, and especially as change leaders, Our mindset, our attitudes, our emotions, even our thoughts are contagious with the people that we lead. They're contagious within our organizations. And it comes down to a simple fact that we're mammals. It really comes down to something that simple because of the way that our brains are. And so we're going to talk about the neuroscientific basis for this phenomenon of the emotional contagion. Paint a picture in your brain for a second of a herd of deer or a herd of antelope, and they're peacefully grazing in an open meadow. And maybe there's a forest surrounding this open meadow, and maybe there's 30 or 40 deer peacefully grazing. And they're enjoying their meal, and one of the deer, just one, senses danger in the forest. Picture what happens in that situation with 30 or 40 deer peacefully grazing and one senses danger. What happens to the other animals? They perk up just like that change leader does. When the change leader senses some danger, the other ones sense the same danger. And whatever's happening with that change leader, that first deer that senses the danger, drives the feelings, the emotions, the thoughts, the perceptions, even the beliefs of the other deers that are following. And so when that one deer gets startled, all of the deer get startled, and they all protect themselves by running away from the sense of danger. And that is because as mammals, our brains are based on this open loop system. And the open loop system is essentially this phenomenon for us as human beings that we appropriate our feelings and our thoughts from other people because our brains are in this open loop status. And open loop status essentially means that we manage internal feelings and internal cognitive structures and internal mindset structures with outside phenomena or outside sources. So when we're in open loop status, which is our natural state, we're looking for other things outside of our person to manage our internal feelings. We can go into closed loop status intentionally. We have to consciously go into closed loop status to protect ourselves from doing that. And so when you think of people doing like meditation or yoga or even mindfulness exercises, that's essentially closing the open loop of our brain. And then we're managing our feelings and managing our thoughts and managing our mindset when our brain is closed through our own internal cognitive and mental processes. And that's when we're in closed loop. But our natural state is when we're open. So how does this play out in the real world? So you know how sometimes, imagine yourself on a Monday morning and you're walking into work and you have a meeting first thing in the morning and you've got your coffee and your cell phone and maybe a notepad and your keys, and you're in a pretty good mood, and you walk into a large meeting and you can tell that people are stressed out. You can tell that there's some tension in the air and maybe people are feeling a little bit stressed. And it changes your mood just a little bit. You can feel the tension in the room. You can walk in the room and kind of just sense that something's going on. And it adjusts your mood just a little bit. You feel this kind of underlying pressure to match the temperature of the room. And so you kind of moderate your positive feelings with the negative energy that's in the room. That's evidence of the emotional contagion because our brains are picking up those signals formally and informally from other people. And it's guiding our brains to kind of adjust to what's happening in the room. You know, another example is maybe you're in a neutral mood and you walk into a situation, you hear people laughing and smiling and they're aggressively laughing about something funny, and you walk into a room and you smile. You haven't heard the joke, you don't know what they're talking about, but you could tell that other people are laughing and smiling, and your natural instinct is to at least smile and maybe chuckle a little bit. Even though you don't have a rational reason to laugh or to smile, you're just appropriating and borrowing those feelings from the people that are around you. That's, again, the function of just because we're mammals. It's just an animal instinct that we have. As our natural state, our feelings are being shared in our organizations, and we recruit those and appropriate those from other people. And in an organization, that travels through our organization like electricity over like a network of wires. So whatever you're putting as a leader on that network travels throughout your organization because everybody's watching you. And unfortunately, that network doesn't discriminate between adaptive and maladaptive feelings or behaviors. Whatever you put on that network as a change leader is what travels in your organization. So we have to be very intentional about what we're putting on that network in our organization. We have to know that we're always in open loop system. So we're emoting and putting out feelings and putting out thoughts and putting out attitudes and putting out beliefs, and other people are borrowing those from us. Because of the simple fact that as mammals in a herd, we appropriate those feelings and thoughts of other people. And it's important to remember that what we put on that network drives what's happening in our organization, and that network doesn't discriminate. So when we're in this open loop system, going back to kind of the emotional cognitive perspective, it even has physiological effects in our bodies. So like our blood pressure can change and The way that we secrete fatty acids can change, and the way we secrete different hormones changes, and our cardiovascular system actually changes, and the way that we sleep changes, even our immune system changes. And so it has real physiological effects on our body. And we have to remember that those physiological effects, when we're in stress situations, are very palpable to people. And those are the signals in our brain that tell us we're either in a danger sense or that we're safe. And when we sense danger, we act differently than when we sense safety. And sadly, change is not a very comfortable situation. And so as a leader, we have to remember that when we're in those stressful situations, the way that we're emoting is impacting other people. So what's happening in our brains from a hormonal perspective is we're experiencing stress hormones like cortisol that creates the physiological stress symptoms in our bodies. And cortisol is one of the many hormones that we experience throughout our bodies that makes us feel stressed and makes us feel somewhat unsafe. And so when a problem happens in an implementation setting, our brains are experiencing a dump of cortisol. Now, when we're joining the herd, so think back to that metaphor that I gave you of the deer or the antelope in the meadow. When we're joining the herd, we also get oxytocin that is engaged in our brains, which makes us feel safe. It kind of mediates the physiological symptoms of the stress. Oxytocin is the same hormone of, some people call it the bonding hormone. It's the same hormone that happens when we hug somebody or when we have a good interpersonal experience with somebody. Connecting with another human being, whether it's physical or emotional, produces oxytocin in our brain. And so when we have situations when we're joining other human beings, we're experiencing that oxytocin dump. So it starts to make us think about change for a second, is that change is stressful, so we get cortisol. But when we join other people in experiencing those things, we also get a good feeling in our brain with oxytocin, because oxytocin feels good. So when we join other people in feeling bad, our brain is telling us we have to feel good about feeling bad. And that's why there's this cliche in our world of misery loves company. So think about that for a second from a change perspective, is joining other people, oxytocin, even if they're feeling bad, cortisol, is what creates the cycle of misery loves company. People like to feel good about feeling bad when they join other people in doing so. And so as a change leader, you have to remember that other people are going to appropriate those feelings. And there really is a physiological and neuroscientific component to the way that we're leading change in our organizations, and the way that we're putting out feelings in our organizations, and the way that we're putting out our mindset within our organizations. There's been lots of studies about this positive-negative asymmetry. I was reading one time about a series of studies, and there was this psychologist who was combing through well over 100 studies to find any evidence of human beings being more preferential to positive feelings than negative. And one of the studies that was cited was interesting in that it took a look at about 558 words in the English language for any kind of emotion or kind of any feeling. And the psychologist coded all these different words that we have in our language to code them. Are they related to a negative emotion, or are they related to a positive emotion? And in our English vocabulary, almost 2/3 of the feelings that we have put words to are negative, and only about 1/3 are related to positive. And so that starts to signal to us that we have a preference for negative emotions to such a degree that we create new words over the time of our human culture, that we create new words and new terms for different shades of negative emotions. Our brain responds disproportionately to negative situations. There's another study I remember where they were doing some brain imaging of different subjects and showing them different types of images from good to bad. And some images were fairly neutral. Some images were really scary, of car accidents and crash scenes and critical incidents. And some images were really positive and provoking good feelings. And they looked at some of the subjects in the study, and they recorded how much they remembered from the images, how long they remembered, and to what level of detail they remembered from the images. And sure enough, it was found that people remembered more things about the negative images. They remembered them for longer, and they remembered more detail from the negative images than the positive images. So think of real life, for example, when you see an accident on the highway and you see people, kind of focusing on the accident and traffic gets congested. That's because people see that negative thing and their brain responds to it very, very acutely. But when we see something that's positive or normal, our brain just doesn't seem to react in the same way. And that's a safety mechanism for our brain. Again, because we're mammals, it's a signal to us to go into fight or flight mode. And so we have to remember that it's our natural state in our brain is to focus on negative things because we feel that a little bit deeper. And the psychologist that I mentioned ended up giving up because he could not find any studies that showed that we have a preference for positive things over negative things in terms of the way that our brain reacts to those situations. So as a change leader, we have to be very intentional about achieving a balance between positive and negative things in our organizations. Because we feel negative things differently than we do positive things, we have to try to tip the scale, and we have to really emote things differently in our change situations. Because again, people are borrowing and appropriating those feelings. So trusting the vision means that you first believe that your beliefs and your attitudes and your feelings are contagious. And so we have to be relentlessly optimistic in leading change. And relentless optimism does not mean puppies and rainbows type of optimism. That's not what it means. What it means is that we have to be relentlessly committed to being optimistic in change situations. So when we start having problems in implementation settings, and we start having challenges, and we start having stresses, and we're starting to get into that cocoon, so to speak, we have to increase our commitment to being optimistic about the change. And that's what Trust the Vision is about. Because if you think of somebody that you're following and they're showing pessimism and doubt and those types of things, you're going to appropriate those feelings from your leader. So as a leader, we have this responsibility to share our optimism for the vision throughout our organizations. And we get into these situations all the time in implementation settings where we're uncertain about whether the new thing is going to work, or we're uncertain about how to solve a problem, or we're uncertain if a situation is going to get in the way of our implementation effort. And it's natural for us to experience uncertainty and to kind of confuse that with fear. You can imagine yourself in a situation when you're driving for a second and you get lost. Your instinct is not to say, hey, I'm lost. That's a good thing. We're going to learn something new today. Your instinct when you're lost when you're driving is to be scared and to try to correct the course back to something that you're comfortable with. And so as a change leader, we have to separate those feelings in our brain of just because we're uncertain doesn't mean we have to be fear. The gap of uncertainty between knowing and not knowing is a really scary place for people. And a lot of times when we're in implementation situations, because it takes a long time to change, we're uncertain if it's going to work. We're uncertain about what to do with a problem. We're uncertain about handle situations. And that doesn't mean we have to be scared. It means we have to be relentlessly committed to getting through that situation. We also have to believe that being good is the enemy of great. Good is relatively easy. It's easy for organizations to be good. It's great that's really hard. And so when we settle for being good, that's what we get. We have to settle for being great, and that's the hard work. Great is outside of that chrysalis. Another thought is that we have to spend more time in the windshield and less time in the mirror. The windshield here represents the future, and the mirror represents the past. And we have this cliche in our language that hindsight's 20/20. And hindsight is, again, looking back in that mirror. And when we get through situations, we look in hindsight and we say, I should have done that, I should have done this, I should have done that. And that's why we say hindsight's 20/20. But we don't have a cliche that says foresight is 20/20. And why is that? Foresight means when we look into the future, we don't have clarity, we have uncertainty. And as a change leader, we have to believe that our foresight, our vision, our trust in the future is sharp. Because people are going to borrow those feelings. So we have to spend more time looking into the future and less time into the past. If we focus on the past, exclusively in the past, we're going to look into all those situations of failure and all those situations of problems, and we're going to start to think in our minds that that's how this situation is going to go. And when we start thinking that, other people start thinking that. And so as a change leader, we have to adopt the notion that our foresight, our vision, our trust in the future is 20/20. And spend more time looking into that future. As a change leader, you're the North Star for other people to follow. People are following your feelings and your emotions and your level of trust in the innovation. And so as a leader, we have to have the gumption to be able to know that people are following in our mindset, and we have to trust in others to carry out the vision. We have to extend trust in other people to carry out the work because they're trusting us to lead it through. Principle number 2, Murphy hates us. We're all familiar with Murphy's Law of what can go wrong will go wrong, and that's no different in the world of change. Stuff goes wrong. What can go wrong will go wrong, and sometimes things go from bad to worse fairly quickly. In the real world of implementation, as a change leader, we have to adopt the mindset and we have to carry the idea that things are supposed to go wrong. Think back to that cocoon for a second. That caterpillar is going into that cocoon expecting to change and willing to withstand the problems that are inevitable. As a change leader, we have to take the mindset that change is inevitably arduous and inevitably full of problems. And we have to carry the idea with our followers that things are going to go wrong and that that's the rule. It's not the exception. Problems are not the different thing. Problems are the normal thing. And we have to simply adopt the idea that it's okay for problems to happen. We see a lot happen in organizations where change starts going really well at the beginning because we operate off of organizational willpower. And organizational willpower and personal willpower are really, it's an exhaustible resource. It's like temporary fuel in our gas tank. We can only operate off of willpower for so long. And that's no different in organizations. And we see change start going well at first, and the energy is good, and things start going really well. And then over time, as the real world comes in, change starts eroding slowly back to status quo. And that's because we've exhausted our willpower. We've exhausted that initial energy that happens at the beginning of a change initiative. And we start getting tired because there's problems, and the real world starts just kind of inhabiting everything that we're doing, and we start getting back familiar with the way things were before the change started happening. And if you're in an implementation project and everything is going right and you're leading change and you kind of perceive that everything is going really, really well, you might not be paying attention to what's really going on. That's probably a time that you're going to have to ask all aspects of the organization, give me candid feedback about what's really happening. Let's kind of take the veneer off of what we think is going to happen. Let's talk about what's really happening. As a change leader, we have to really study the real world of what's going on. And if things are going relatively well, we have to almost question it and say, we might not be paying attention. And when things are going right, you have to kind of take that as a signal that I need to study what's happening, study what's going right, and try to find out what's really going wrong. Murphy's normal. We have to invite him to our home and ask him to stay for a drink and dinner and just kind of hang out with him. And Murphy Hates Us is about exactly that. It's about just saying that it's normal for us to have problems in the world of implementation, and we need to just live with that for a while and get comfortable with the idea that problems happen. Like I said, implementation, it's messy and it's arduous and it could be unpredictable. And as a change leader, we have to plan for failure. Of course, we have to plan for success because, again, we want to trust the vision. So we have to mindfully plan for success. But that also means really confronting the situations when failure is happening. And we have to plan to fail. In the Academy version of Implementation Leadership, we actually give people some concrete tools to be able to try to predict their failure and how to diagnose that potential failure and how to look into the future and start to diagnose when those problems are inevitably going to happen, and how to start developing some change strategies for when we get to those situations that are inevitably problematic. So strong implementation leaders, we have to build failure into our implementation plans. Imagine a time that you got a grant for a change initiative or innovation, or imagine a time when you developed a schedule, say, for an implementation or a change project, and you really think about this schedule and you start setting some dates about when this is going to happen, when that's going to happen, and you say, well, we're going to receive the granting on this day, and by the end of the grant, we're going to achieve these outcomes, and we're going to achieve these great results. Well, about midway through the project, when you look at that schedule, you're like, wow, we didn't even come close to that schedule. And that's because things happen. And we can't often foresee at the beginning of a change project all the stuff that's going to happen in the future. But as a change leader, we have to do some work to be able to make room for those inevitable problems. The idea is that as a change leader, when you plan to fail, it's really not about saying, what's our solution when we get there? It's about setting the mindset that when we experience those problems, we experience less stress when we get there because we predicted it. So when we experience less stress, and when we predict that failure that's going to happen, other people around us will have that same feeling of, okay, we saw this coming. We got this. We got this problem handled. We saw it coming. We know things are going to happen. We know things are going to go wrong. We can adapt. We can be agile. We can figure this out. That frustration, again, think back to that cocoon for a second. That frustration is what obviously drives us back to status quo. And so when we're planning to fail and when we take the mindset that things are going to go wrong, we lessen the frustration with other people when that inevitable problem happens. And that's what Murphy is about. It's not about prescribing a solution in the future. It's about taking the mindset that when we experience those problems, our frustration can be moderated by planning to fail. That way, when we get to those situations, we're much more fluid, much more adaptive. Principle 3, be comfortable being uncomfortable. Keeping in mind that we're trusting the vision, we're realizing that our emotions are contagious. Principle 2, Murphy hates us, we're planning for failure, and we are working to know that we're going to have problems. That also means that when we get into that cocoon, so to speak, we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable in order for us to change. We have to live with the uncomfort of change. This is what we're told about change, maybe in college or maybe at a traditional conference. This is what we're told about change. A lot of the people who study change would say that change comes in stages, and you can see the Kubler-Ross change curve here, for example, that shows these different stages of organizational change, and things start out normal, and then you go into denial and things get heavy, and then you get frustrated and you start having bad feelings, and you get into depression and things start getting worse, and then eventually it just gets better and better and better and better, and then you get to the end where everything is just great. So it gives us this illusion that change is rough for a while and then it just gets better and better and better. Just not true in the real world. Kotter has an 8-step model. This came from the 1990s that he proposes that there are 8 steps to organizational change. And it starts out in level 1 where things are bad, and then it gets to level 8 and things just start getting better and better and better. And again, it's linear. Again, it's sequential. And the idea here is that it just gets better and better. I've not been a part of a change initiatives in the real world of the justice system where change just gets better and better and better in linear ways. A lot of people believe in the 3-step change model. Books and things like that kind of boil organizational change down to 3 basic steps of unfreeze, change, and refreeze. And the idea is that, in order for us to change, we have to unfreeze our practices for a while. So that's one stage. Stage 2, we change some stuff for a while. And then change 3, we lock back into non-changing and we refreeze. And then we kind of move forward. I've never experienced organizational change to be 3 simple steps of stop changing, change, and then stop changing. In the community and justice system, change is perpetual. Change is always going, and we have different change initiatives, some internal, some external. We're always in some state of organizational change for something or another. And so I don't know where we can say that change in our organizations are simple steps and linear, and that we stop changing and that things just get better and better and better. So what is it about these change models that causes us problems? What causes us problems is it's not real world in the sense that it's atypical. Those change models that I showed you are probably the 10 to 20 to 30% that are successful, not the 70% that fail. So if you think of an example like maybe you see a TV commercial about some weight loss program and you see people with great results, and they show a before and after picture and they say, if you do our program, you're going to get these results, and this person lost this much weight and this person lost that much weight, and this guy had this big giant transformation, and if you use our program, then you're going to get these results. And then at the very bottom, there's this caveat, there's fine print, and it basically says that these results are not typical. And I believe that the change models that I just showed you are not typical. They're atypical. Again, think back to that failure rate that we started with. I want to talk about what's typical in organizations and how to deal with that. And what's typical is that things are hard. So if you look at this person on the screen, she's doing some yoga here. She is choosing to be uncomfortable. She even dresses for the occasion and maybe has a special room in her house to be able to do this yoga, and has special clothes and a special mat, and maybe even has on her calendar, I'm going to do yoga 4 times a week in the morning at 7 o'clock. And so she's planning to be uncomfortable for a while in order to make herself better. So she's choosing this chaos. She's choosing this discomfort, intentionally speaking. And as a change leader, we have to do the same thing. We have to choose to be uncomfortable when we want change and implementation in our organizations. We have to find comfort in the chaos of change. It's that discomfort that is a signal to us that we're starting to change. And so that's where being uncomfortable comes from. As human beings, when we learn and when we develop and when we grow, we need to think about these 4 zones of learning and competence. 4 zones of how it feels when we're trying to change. So zone number 1, we can call unconscious incompetence, or maybe we can call it unconscious not knowing. And that's where ignorance is bliss comes from. And the idea here is that when we don't know that we're not good at something, we're pretty comfortable with that. Ignorance of, maybe we're trying to learn a new musical instrument or develop a new skill or start a new habit. And before trying to start to change, we're pretty good not knowing that we don't know stuff. And that's a pretty comfortable feeling. So stage 1 is when we're unconsciously incompetent, when we don't know that we don't know something. And again, that's a pretty comfortable feeling. So when we get through stage 1 and into stage 2, conscious incompetence, we start learning and we get to the stage where we're consciously aware that we're incompetent. Imagine again trying to learn a new skill, and maybe you picked up that musical instrument for the first time, or you picked up a new habit and you find out, man, I'm not very good at this. And that's a frustrating feeling for people. And so when we get to conscious incompetence, we now know that we don't know something. And those feelings of bliss that we had in stage 1 start being transitioned to feelings of stress and panic and worry and doubt and all these things that maybe I'm not be able to do this. Maybe I'm not set up for this. Maybe this organization isn't set up for this. And conscious incompetence is where people get stuck. And it's not until we go through this stressful and awkward learning stage that we get to conscious competence. And conscious competence is when we now know that we know something. We have to consciously work at being good at the new thing. It's not automatic, it's not habitual, but we have to put mental energy into the new thing, and we're consciously aware that we're starting to get good at it. It's the transition from stage 2 to stage 3 where people get stuck and where organizations get stuck. Again, go back to the metaphor of the butterfly. If that butterfly goes into that cocoon or that chrysalis and says, you know what, I don't like this stage, I'm in stage 2, I'm consciously aware that this sucks, I'm going to go back to stage 1, I'm going to go back to status quo. It's those that can resolve themselves through that arduous process, that you're consciously aware that things are going to be hard for a while. And when you get to stage 3, that's when change really starts happening, is I'm consciously aware that I'm getting good at something. And it's not until we get to unconscious competence, or when it's automatic, it's kind of integrated into our habits, that's when real change starts happening and starts sustaining at the organizational level. And that's when we start getting better feelings of being blissful again and being happy, because it's kind of our second nature, it's our new habit. And that's not until we start getting comfortable again. So we have to be aware as change leaders that as individuals and as humans, we go through these zones and we kind of vacillate in and out of these different zones at different times. And it's just important that we're aware that when we're in conscious competence, that we now know that we don't know something, those don't come with good feelings. And again, feelings are contagious. Feelings travel through our organizations, mindset travels through our organizations. And so we have to just be very aware and self-aware. We call it leadership's climate control, where we just have to be able to manage our own mindset around the stages that we're in areas of change. So I told you that I don't really believe in some of these linear and simple change models, but what I do believe in is the productive zone of disequilibrium. And this takes a little bit to understand, as it looks fairly complicated, but it's really not. The productive zone of disequilibrium, in my mind, is much more illustrative of the real world. So you'll see a graph there, and you'll see two axes. You'll see a horizontal and a vertical axis. And the horizontal axis, you see, going from left to right represents time. So the left represents now, and towards the right represents the future. Also at the bottom, from the vertical axis perspective, is stasis or status quo, which is fairly comfortable. Again, think back to that 4 zones that we just talked about, that when you're ignorant, it's comfortable. The top represents chaos. And so as you put those two axes together over time, when change starts happening, you go through the first zone, which we'll call the comfort zone, and that's the zone at the bottom of the scale there. The second zone in the middle is the change zone, or we'll call it the productive zone of disequilibrium. That's when change starts happening, but that's also when we're no longer comfortable. And at the top, we see the third zone at the very top, which we'll call the chaos zone. Eventually, people will start experiencing some chaos and some stress, and maybe too much stress, and feel like they're over their perceived limit of tolerance and into the chaos zone. And as a change leader, our job is to navigate people out of the chaos zone into the productive zone of disequilibrium. Our job is not to lead people back into the comfort zone, because when we get back into the comfort zone, we are not changing. We are not in the productive zone of disequilibrium. We're back to the unproductive zone of disequilibrium. So in order for us to be productive, we have to be out of balance. So as a change leader, when we start experiencing some of those chaos areas, there's a couple things that happen, and these are the 2 black lines that you see labeled work avoidance or technical challenge, is some people will try to chase the comfort zone and avoid the work, or maybe create a technical cop-out for why we can't do something. So say, for example, you get a grant and the grant says you have to do incentives for your clients or something, and somebody's experiencing the stress of that, and they say, well, we can't really do this because we don't have the staff, or we don't do this because we don't have the money, or we don't want to do this because we have other priorities. And a lot of times those are just kind of technical cop-outs or technical flags or technical excuses to get back to the zone of comfort. And so as a change leader, we have to be able to discern through, are people just trying to avoid the work? Are they just kind of throwing out these kind of technical cop-outs? What's really happening? Because as a change leader, we have to be adaptive and navigate people through the productive zone of disequilibrium. And that's going to go up and down, up and down, up and down over time. And people are going to be vacillating through some level of discomfort over time. I was working with an organization once and was teaching this to them, and one of the change leaders said, "Oh, I get it. I kind of see it like the streetlights. I see it like a green, yellow, and red zone. And I kind of see the bottom zone is the green zone, where that's where it's comfortable. And the middle zone's kind of the yellow zone, again, using the streetlights as an example. And the chaos zone is the red." And I started thinking about that. I told her, and I said, "I can see where you're going with that. The comfort zone is green. That's where we want to go. And the change zone is a little bit yellow. We start wanting to pump the brakes or downshift. And then when we get to the chaos zone, we want to kind of put on the brakes." And while I appreciate the notion of using the streetlights as a metaphor for this, I don't agree with the way that they're ordered. Here's the way I do think about it, though. If we're going to use the streetlights as an example, this is the way I think about it. The change zone is the go zone, the green zone, and that's when we're not comfortable. The yellow zone, the chaos zone, is where we want to pump the brakes and where we want to kind of downshift a little bit and maybe navigate people and maybe just slow down just a little bit to get back to the green zone or the productive zone, but is still uncomfortable. The red zone is the comfort zone. The red zone is where we don't want to be. The red zone is the place where change fails. And so if we're going to use the streetlights as a metaphor over the productive zone of disequilibrium, then we have to think that the comfort zone is red. We don't want to be there. The productive zone is stressful, and that's the green zone. That's where we want to be. But when we get to the chaos zone, that's when we want to start downshifting and pumping the brakes and yielding and maybe slowing down just a little bit, or maybe lightening the load just a little bit, but not so much that we're back in the change zone. With organizational change, we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. We can also think of the comfort zone as a series of bubbles. And the comfort zone is this small little bubble that we're in where we feel safe and we're under control, and it makes us feel warm and comfortable to be in this very small bubble of what we know and what we're familiar with. And just outside that comfort zone is the fear zone. And when we get outside that comfort bubble into the fear bubble, that's when we start questioning our confidence and we start having doubts, and we might even have some excuses to manage the feelings of that, and we start appropriating the opinions of others. So go back to the emotional contagion, and principle number 1 a little bit is when we're all experiencing some fear and we are all experiencing what's going on, and think of those deer metaphor that I told you about, we start looking around and see, what are other people feeling? Are they feeling like me? Are they scared like me? And we start validating our feelings by borrowing them from other people. And that's when we start recruiting. And again, those feelings start being contagious throughout the organizations. And we start questioning our own confidence. And we have to get through that fear zone into the learning zone. And the learning zone, beyond that fear bubble, that's when we start confronting the challenges, and that's when we start getting the new skills, and we even start stretching the limits of our comfort zone. And when we get through that fear zone, we start stretching that comfort bubble to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And when that comfort zone gets bigger, we start stretching that, we become more agile, we become more adaptable, we start getting more creative because we start becoming more comfortable with the uncertainty that's happening in our organizations. And again, as a leader, getting through that fear bubble and into the learning bubble is contagious with other folks. And even beyond that learning zone is when growth happens. Farthest away from that comfort bubble is the growth zone, and that's when we start innovating. That's when we start discovering new purpose. That's when we start getting sustainable change, and that's when we start elevating other people. And as a change leader, we have to think well beyond the comfort zone, through the fear zone, through the learning zone, and into the growth zone. Implementation leadership is leading people through all those bubbles well into the growth zone and stretching the limits of what we perceive to be comfortable. Status quo leadership is helping people stay in that little zone of comfort, in that little bubble that makes us feel warm and safe. We have to be comfortable being uncomfortable, and we have to help others do the same. So we have to believe that in order to succeed, we have to improve. In order to improve, we have to learn. And in order to learn, we have to fail. As a change leader, we have to adopt the mindset that failure precedes learning. We also have to take the notion that crisis is the intersection where danger and opportunity live. When we get into problem situations, we might perceive that as a crisis. And again, because of that negative positive asymmetry that I mentioned in principle number 1, our brain likes to focus on the danger. Our brain needs to focus on the problems in order to protect us from feeling safe. So it's easy for us and it's natural for us to focus on the danger. As a change leader, we have to stop, we have to reflect, and we have to also know that when we're in problem situations, there's also an opportunity for healthy change. And that gap, when we start experiencing those crisis situations, leaves opportunities to innovate and leaves opportunities for healthy initiatives. All of us have been through recently this COVID-19 crisis. And early in the COVID situation, we started experiencing those stresses where things started falling apart. And people started adapting, people started changing, and started becoming more familiar with technology and started inventing ways to do their work in different ways. And people started learning through their uncomfort that we can change. And it starts illuminating other opportunities that we maybe never thought before, or maybe we never perceived them before, or maybe we just ignored some of those opportunities. And COVID even helped us maybe illuminate some of the things that were pre-existing opportunities for healthy innovation that always existed, but we just chose not to adapt to those situations. And so as a change leader, we have to just get to this point when we start having problems and we start having what we perceive to be crisis situations, that yes, there's problems and yes, there's danger, but there also is opportunity for healthy change. And that's when we start getting creative. That's when we start getting agile. That's when we start getting adaptable. And we have to just hold ourselves in that space of knowing that we can learn when we're starting to fail. So with our third principle, we just have to adopt the idea that there's no comfort in the growth zone and there's no growth in the comfort zone. The purpose of change is to grow. And if we're going to grow, we have to abandon comfort. We have to adopt the mindset that we're going to be more committed to the change. We're going to be more committed to the implementation. We're going to be more committed to the outcomes and abandon our commitment to our comfort zone. Because that comfort zone, when we clutch onto that comfort zone, that's what stops us from changing. What we need to clutch onto is the future. What we need to clutch onto is the outcomes. What we need to clutch onto is strategic implementation. And when we clutch onto that, we have to release the reliance on our comfort zone. Principle 4, adapt or die. The idea with adapt or die is that as a change leader, we confront problems all the time and we want to go right to solutions because of the way that we operate. We get to a problem, or maybe somebody brings us a problem and they say, "Mrs. Change Leader, what do I do? I have a problem. How do I handle this?" And we want to get to a solution right away to help that person deal with the problem. As a change leader, we have to not get to the solution right away, and we have to stop and think and first diagnose our challenge. And we start with the idea that sometimes symptoms are cleverly disguised as problems. And the first question we should ask when we get to a problem situation is first, is this a symptom or a problem? If it's a symptom, then it's an artifact of something deeper, something bigger, maybe something even more complex. And if we believe that it's a symptom, we have to ask the question, what's it a symptom of? What is driving this symptom? If we can continue to answer that question, is what is driving this symptom, then we can start discerning the underlying root problem. Once we get to the problem, then we have to stop and diagnose that problem as either technical or adaptive. Technical problems are fairly black and white. You can think of technical problems as fairly easy to identify. They usually live in one or two places of the organization, and they can be solved fairly quickly and usually by somebody in authority position. So an example of a technical problem could be something like, we don't have the money to do this change initiative. So say, for example, we want to do incentives for clients or something like that. And we want to do that, we desire to do that, we aim to do that, but we don't have money to be able to do it. And the way we solve that problem is with money. We apply for a grant, or we ask the person in charge of the money, "Can I have some money to do this thing?" They say yes, problem solved. That is an example of a technical problem that is solved with a technical solution. Adaptive problems are what are more dominant in organizational change initiatives and in implementation projects. Adaptive problems are difficult to identify, but they're easy to deny. They're more complex, and they're usually rooted in beliefs and attitudes and culture and mindset and things like that. And when we get to adaptive problems, they don't live in just one place of the organization. They live in many places of the organization, maybe even at the organizational cultural level. And so when we have adaptive problems, we don't have clear solutions. We don't have black and white tangible solutions. We can't just check a box and make sure that the problem is solved. When we have adaptive problems, we have to experiment, we have to try things, we have to fail, and adaptive problems require a lot of experimentation because the solutions are unclear and because the solutions rarely one size doesn't fit all. So I want to talk about another example of problem mutation, or when you solve an adaptive problem with a technical solution, it creates new adaptive problems. I was working one time with an organization, and the parole director came in and was charged with the responsibility to change the culture of the parole office. And the pre-existing culture of the parole office was very law enforcement oriented, and they wore black uniforms with their vests on the outside, and they had their badge and the chain on the end of the badge and showed their weapon, and that was their daily uniform. And they definitely looked like militarized or quasi-military law enforcement officers, and the new parole director wanted to change the culture away from a really hierarchical and militarized environment. He decided to say that I'm going to change the culture by changing the uniforms because I don't want parole to be perceived like a law enforcement agency. He was trying to get them to change to a more behavior change oriented organization. So he decided to change the uniforms and change the dress code for the parole officers and didn't really involve them much in the change. He thought that if he changed to civilian clothes and had a different type of uniform, that it would start to change the culture of the organization. So he announced to his staff that starting next month, on the first day of the month, we're going to start wearing khaki pants and a blue polo shirt, and it's going to have the organization's logo on it. And we're going to keep our badge in our pocket, and we're going to dress like civilians and act like civilians so that we can be behavior change oriented and not have that kind of wall between us and the clients that feels like law enforcement. Now, his thought to moderate the change was to pay for the new uniforms. So his big announcement to the staff were that we're changing your uniforms. You're going to wear civilian clothes, and because we care for you, we're going to help you pay for it. So they offered a stipend to help pay for the clothing. Now, as you can imagine, the problem that he started with was organizational culture. He wanted to change the culture, and culture is an adaptive issue. Culture is a complex problem. It's a complex scenario that lives everywhere in the organization where there's not clear solutions. So when he decided to apply the technical solution, which was changing uniforms, it didn't change the culture in a healthy way. It actually aggravated the parole officers towards the change. Imagine a situation where it was announced to you and you weren't involved in the change that we're going to change what you wear every day. We're going to try to change your identity, even though you were hired as a law enforcement officer and we look for your certifications as a law enforcement officer and you were trained as a law enforcement officer and you hang out with other law enforcement officers and we use law enforcement type of terms and we identify with the law enforcement identity. All that's going to be abated by new clothes. That's a technical solution to a problem that isn't technical. And as you can imagine, the parole officers were angry. It aggravated their pre-existing negative feelings about the change in their parole director. He didn't change the culture. He just kind of aggravated the staff because he didn't involve them in the change and he wasn't really addressing the cultural issue. He was addressing their clothes. Their clothes are a technical thing. Their thinking and their orientation and their identity, that's an adaptive thing. So that's an example that I like to use about problem mutation of when you have an adaptive problem and you solve with a technical solution. So again, in implementation situations, we ask first, is this a symptom or a problem? When we get to the problem stage, we start saying, is it technical or is it adaptive? And if it's technical, we apply a technical solution. If it's adaptive, we apply an adaptive solution. So say, for example, you're doing an implementation project and you're starting to sense that the staff are not buying into the change, or maybe the mid-level supervision is not buying into the change. And you solve that problem with a technical solution, which is maybe an order or a policy or a directive or some kind of performance management tool that says, you know, you're not changing, you're not doing the right thing. I'm going to put it in your performance plan and make you change because it's my directive to you that you're supposed to change. So let's look at that situation. The team doesn't want to change. That's an adaptive problem because it's rooted in beliefs and it lives in the team and it's a little bit squishier and more ambiguous. And we solve that problem with a technical solution, which is a policy or a procedure or a directive or a performance tool. What really happens in that situation? We actually aggravate the pre-existing negative beliefs and negative attitudes about change. Because we've solved that adaptive problem with a technical solution, we've created yet another adaptive problem, which is aggravated feelings. Adaptive solutions are needed when we have adaptive problems, and those require experimentation and discovery, and they take time to perfect, and it's not real clear. Problem mutation happens when we apply a technical solution to an adaptive problem. Problem mutation is when it actually creates more adaptive problems. Adapt or Die is about stopping and thinking and diagnosing your challenge and saying, number one, is it a symptom or a problem? And when we find out that it's a problem, we diagnose it's technical or adaptive, and then we apply a technical solution to a technical problem and an adaptive solution to an adaptive problem. Principle 5, fail forward and fail often. For some reason in our culture, we've made failure a vice and perfection a virtue. I tend to believe the opposite. I think perfectionism is a vice and failure is a virtue, and that's what drives Principle 5. The idea is that if you want to increase your successes with change, we have to intentionally double our failures. We have to have enthusiastic pursuit of failure because, again, change is messy and arduous and unpredictable and full of trial and error. Perfectionism, we've come to believe, is a good thing. Imagine yourself last time you interviewed somebody for a job, or maybe even some time that you interviewed for, and that question always comes up of some version of what's your strengths and what's your weaknesses, or what was your biggest challenge in that situation and what are you really good at? And so people will talk about their strengths in an interview situation, and then when we ask about our weaknesses or areas of development or whatever we want to call it, a lot of interviewees will say things like, well, I'm a perfectionist, I'm a workaholic, and I'm a perfectionist, and that's my weakness. And the intention is to pitch your failure or your perfectionism, which is really, in your mind, a good thing, as a weakness. Because we've been conditioned to believe that perfectionism is somehow a virtue. Perfectionism is a vice, in my opinion, because it holds us into a place where we don't want to move forward unless we have a perfect solution. And we feel that an imperfect solution is somehow a problem solution. And in the world of implementation, there are no perfect solutions. Because most problems are adaptive, we can't have black and white solutions applied to gray problems. And so a lot of times change leaders get stalled and they get stumped and they really get frozen because of perfectionist type of thinking. And so when we get into those situations, we have to believe that perfectionism is not virtuous. It's a vice. It's something that we hold on to stay comfortable in not moving forward. So the idea is that we have to plan to fail and build failure into our plans. We have to believe that success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. Go back to Principle 1, trusting the vision and relentless optimism. Success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. We have to increase our commitment to the vision. We have to increase our commitment to optimism. We have to increase our commitment to success and abandon the idea that we can't fail. In our brains, we have to distinguish that just because we experience failure doesn't mean we are a failure. And that is a problem with the way that we think a lot, is that we like to label ourselves as being a failure because we experience failure. And if you think back to some of your most profound learning experiences in life, and it doesn't matter whether it's a professional environment or a personal environment, stop and reflect for a second on some of the deepest learning that you've ever had in your life. When you think about some of those deep learning, think about, was that preceded by some kind of failure? And more often than not, a lot of those deep learnings are preceded by some kind of a healthy failure. And that's why I believe that we have to fail forward and fail often. We have to embrace failure as a precedent to learning. If we stop and think about this for a second, I like to think about the WAVE as a really good example of implementation leadership up to this point. I think we've all been to some kind of professional sporting event, whether it's NFL football or NBA or hockey or maybe college football or things like that, and you'll see the WAVE happen in a stadium. And here in Colorado, our Denver Broncos stadium is about 70,000 people. And who usually starts the WAVE in the football stadium? It's usually two people with lowered inhibitions. It's two change leaders, usually two drunk guys or two kids, neither of whom have any inhibitions. They're willing to fail. They're willing to trust this vision. They start the change initiative, and they have this really ambitious and audacious goal that the two of me, of the 70,000 people, are going to start a change to get 70,000 people to stand up, do the WAVE, and look kind of silly. And those change leaders really start with the right mindset of, I'm going to trust in the vision that the two of us can get 70,000 people to change. Principle number 2, they know that things are going to go wrong. They know that Murphy hates us. They know that things are going to happen. The other team is going to score a touchdown right in the middle of our wave. We know that's going to happen, and we are going to figure it out when that happens. They also know that they have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. It's not very comfortable to stand up in a stadium and do the wave and watch other people kind of look at you like, what are you doing? They also know that they got to fail forward and fail often. And they also know that when they confront problems, they have to adapt their responses. So what happens in the wave is this, is the two change leaders start up and they stand up and they do the wave and nothing happens. That's failure number 1. They decide to stand up again and they yell louder. And maybe 4 people stand up around them. Failure number 2. They decide, well, I failed. I'm going to stand up again. And I'm going to yell louder. And I'm going to recruit other people around me to do the same thing. They stand up, 4 people turns to 20. And that's failure number 3. 20 turns to 80, failure number 4. 80 people turns to 200, failure number 5. It gets bigger, failure number 6. Bigger, failure number 7. Bigger, failure number 8. Bigger, failure number 9. Bigger, failure number 10. Pretty soon they have 10,000 people in the stadium after 10 failures. Then the other team scores a touchdown. Failure. Everybody stands down. They stand back up again, and maybe only 200 stand back up. Failure number 11. They stand back up again. Failure number 12. Failure number 13. Failure number 14. Failure number 15. And 20,000 turns to 30,000, turns to 40,000, turns to 60,000. And eventually the whole stadium starts doing the wave. And it goes around and around and around. And everybody's having a good time. And the change is happening. And we got sustainable change that's happening because those two change leaders stood up and they knew that things were going to go wrong. They were committed to relentless optimism. They know their attitudes were contagious. They knew stuff was going to go wrong. They chose to be uncomfortable. They chose to fail forward and fail often. And they chose to adapt their responses. So the wave is a really good example of implementation leadership because it's about the mindset and it's about adopting the idea that we need to fail forward in order to succeed. And what's nice about the wave is when it starts happening, those two change leaders could stand down. Those two kids, those two drunk guys that started the wave can sit down and people will continue to move. And the change will still start happening despite those two change leaders sitting back down because people are following the followers. Implementation leadership is about adopting change, following the principles of implementation leadership with everything that we talked about and thinking about of starting the wave in your organization. So let's go back to the research a little bit. We'll get out of the example of the wave and talk about the organizational research a little bit. The organizational research has taught us that in any organization, you have about 2.5% of people that are the earliest innovators. Those are the people that are the change agents. Those are the people that don't take a lot of work to change. Those are really the change leaders that are really ambitious and audacious and trying to implement the change. And roughly speaking, that's about 2.5% of our organizations. And then the first followers are those early adopters. That's about 13.5%. And those are the people that are going to follow the first innovators. And those people are, again, fairly easy to change, fairly aligned to the evidence-based practice or aligned to the new innovation. And it doesn't take much work for them to be able to change. And leadership in that space, when you get through that first 15%, 16%, it's fairly easy. It doesn't require a lot of energy. It's kind of a natural organic change that happens. It's not until you get to that next third or that early majority, about 34% of organizations, where things start getting tough. The early majority are those people that are maybe cautiously optimistic about the change. Maybe they're just kind of passive, but they're open-minded to the change. And they're not going to change until that first 16% change. So they're really like the first followers that takes a little bit of work from a leadership perspective to really work with and really try to do some extra things. And so one of the things we have to think about as change leaders is the strategies that we adopted to get to that first 16% need to evolve as we get to the early majority. When we get to the early majority, again, we're relentlessly committed to optimism. That's trust the vision. We have to start adapting our responses. This is when we're going to start having problems in the organization. This is where we started diagnosing technical versus adaptive problems and diagnosing symptoms versus problems. This is when stuff starts getting real. And as a leader, when we get to this stage, which is sometimes years into the implementation work, we have to adapt our response as leaders. We cannot let our initial energy for the change erode when we get to this early majority. Because you can imagine what happens is when we get to this early majority, or even the next stage, which is the late majority, if we start releasing our commitment to the change and kind of clutching onto our commitment to the comfort zone, that's when organizations start to fail and when we get to that 70% statistic. The tipping point in an organization is when we can get to the late majority and those people are not cautiously optimistic, they're more pessimistic. Those are the ones that are kind of doubtful about the innovation, they're doubtful about the change, they're doubtful about the success. And once an organization can get through the late majority, then the organization starts changing. And you might have 16% of laggards that don't change at all in an organization. You might have 16% of people that will never change, and that's a natural part of any organization. So the law of diffusion of innovation is important because if you think about, go back to the productive zone of disequilibrium, if your early adopters are telling you, I'm in the chaos zone, change leader, there's too much stuff going on, because they're changing, you have to listen to that very differently than if the late majority of the laggards are telling you, hey, I'm in the chaos zone, I don't think this is going to work, this is too much, I don't really have what it takes to do this organizational change. That group is going to perform differently when they get to that chaos zone. So as a change leader, when you're diagnosing who's having stress problems and who's having change resistance problems and who's having issues with the implementation, you have to kind of think through the law of diffusion of innovation is, am I dealing with the early innovators or am I dealing with the late majority and the laggards? And adjust your response based on that. The law of diffusion of innovation is helpful, and I often think of this, of the metaphor that I think about are people in a rowboat or a canoe maybe. And say that you have 10 people in a canoe or a rowboat, and those 10 people represent 100% of the people in your organization. Well, you have 2 people, statistically speaking, you have about 2 people that are in that canoe or that rowboat, and they got their oars in the water and they're paddling hard and they're really digging into the change and they're really working hard to implement the change. And again, statistically speaking, that's about 2 out of 10 people in any organization. You also have about 2 or 3 people that are on the back of the canoe or the back of the boat, and they're rocking the boat. Those are the laggards. And those are the people that don't have their oars in the water. They're not digging into the change. They're kind of rocking the boat a little bit. And the rest of the people are kind of in the middle. You know, the other 6 people or so, they don't have their oars in the water. They're just kind of passive passengers in the boat. They're not rocking the boat. They're just kind of coasting along, but they are kind of dead weight. And as a change leader, you have to know that the people that are really got their oars in the water and they're really digging in, they're working the hardest and they're really trying hard and they're going to get burnt out. And the people that are rocking the boat, sometimes they're the ones having the most fun, and it's not helping the organization change. And the passengers, they're just kind of watching by and they're not exerting a lot of energy, not causing a lot of problems, but they're not really contributing to the change. From a leadership perspective, I believe that it's everybody's job in an organization to make it great. It's not somebody else's job to make the organization great. And so as a change leader, your job is to get the people that are rowing the boat some help and some relief. And the people that are kind of just passengers in the boat, you got to get their oars in the water. And they've got to get their oars in the water. And the people that are rocking the boat, those laggards, you might have to coach them out or you might have to coach them up and at least get them to be active passengers or preferably get them to be active rowers. In an organization, we have to be mindful of the fact that we have different people at different stages in our organizations and we have to lead a little bit differently. And for those early adopters, we have to strengthen them and support them and lead them and inspire them. And for that middle group, they need skills. They need to believe. We need to focus on the why, and we'll talk about that in a second, and really get to what is it that's driving their status as maybe cautious or pessimistic or maybe cautiously optimistic, because there's something else going on there from a mindset standpoint. Remember, those early adopters are already motivated. And the laggards, we might have to adjust our response to them, and we might be coaching them up or coaching them out. I believe that the people who fear failure ultimately fear learning. So think about that for a second. If we fear failure and we believe that failure precedes learning, then by extension of that, we're fearing learning. We can't fear failure because we can't fear learning and growth. In order to succeed, we have to improve. To improve, we must learn. To learn, we must fail. And we have to focus on progress and not perfection. The mindset that we should adopt from a leadership perspective is that it's not about perfection. It's about progress. And if we share that with other people, if we develop the vocabulary that our organization is never about perfection but about progress, people will feel that it's okay to fail. We will forgive them if they fail forward. We have to have abundant grace in forgiving ourselves and forgiving other people and asking for forgiveness from other people when we are not at our best. And we have to just say that we are in this organization are about progress and we're never about perfection, because perfectionism is really about status quo. When we clutch to perfectionism, we're clutching to this ideal that just doesn't happen in organizations. We have to be real. If we focus on progress and not perfection, we make it okay to fail. And it helps us separate that idea of just because we experience failure doesn't mean we are a failure. There's a well-known organizational tool called Plan, Do, Study, and Act, and it's been in the organizational space for many years. And it's a very effective tool. It's essentially a rapid improvement tool, and the implementation science literature also wraps itself around the PDSA cycle, Plan, Do, Study, Act. The idea is that we plan, so we create a plan, we do it, so we implement, we install, and we improve. And then we study, which means maybe we audit what we did. Maybe we do a fidelity check. Maybe we evaluate what we do. Maybe we stop and think what we do, and we study what's going on. And then we act on whatever we learn in that study period. And once we act when we learn on that study period, we start saying, okay, we're going to go back into the plan stage. And when we go back into the plan stage, we say, okay, we learned in the study period that we did this wrong. We created an action on that by saying we have to adjust the response here. We have to replan, redo, restudy, react. Replan, redo, restudy, and react. And this cycle goes on and on and on in organizations, and we're continually going through these cycles to be able to get to success. And this starts to illuminate why there's not such thing as linear change, because we're in cyclical, ongoing, arduous, awkward, asymmetrical types of change. So the PDSA cycle is really about rapid improvement and kind of taking the idea that we're infinitely involved in some kind of learning. The problem I have with the PDSA cycle is there is something missing. And what is missing in here is failure. The PDSA cycle, I did not invent. I was not smart enough to invent that. If I would have invented the PDSA cycle, knowing what I know now, I would have invented it as plan, do, fail, study, act. PDFSA. Plan, do, fail, study, act. The problem with the PDSA cycle is that it makes failure taboo. It makes it covert. I want to bring failure as overt. I want to make it as an acceptable thing. Because, again, failure precedes learning. So if we adopt the PDSA cycle in our organizations, which is the right thing to do, we should adjust it and say, our job is to plan, do, fail, study, act. Plan, do, fail, study, act. Plan, do, fail, study, act. That is progress, not perfection. That is about fail forward and fail often. That makes it okay to fail. That gives people a space to say it's okay to experiment. It's okay to have trial and error. It's okay to fail because failure precedes learning. In the real world, PDFSA is what is applied to implementation in real-world community and justice settings. Principle 6, culture is king. As an implementation leader, we have to know that culture is always upstream from strategy. Strategy is our evidence-based practice, it's our program, it's our innovation, it's the thing that we're changing. Strategy is also our implementation. Culture is always upstream from our strategy. Culture drives the degree to which our organization is going to experience success or failure with our project. Peter Drucker was a pretty famous management pioneer, and even in the 1950s, he said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. At ACGI, we say, because of the community and justice system, that culture eats strategy for breakfast and lunch and dinner and is still hungry for more. Culture is dominant in implementation settings. Culture will always win if we don't address organizational culture. So what do we mean by organizational culture? Well, if you're mathematically minded, you might think of culture as a bit of an equation. And so say that we take an equation of inputs plus mindset. And inputs is like the people in our organization, and it's all our practices and our habits and our policies and procedures. It's all the really kind of tangible things that we put into our organization, like money and tasks and processes. So a culture is that. Plus, it's the collective mindset of people. So it's the collective beliefs, attitudes, and values. It's the organizational norms from a mindset perspective. It's kind of what do you have to do around here to fit in kind of stuff. And so culture is the sum of inputs plus mindset. So it's all your people and all your habits and all your processes and all your stuff, plus the way that people think and the way that they believe and what their values are and their why. You take the sum of that and you raise it to the power of dialogue and interaction. Inputs plus mindset is strengthened, weakened, and changed by the type of dialogue and the way that people interact in an organization. It's what are they talking about at the water cooler? What is the leader talking about? What values is the leader putting out on that network? Thinking about that emotional contagion, what mindset are we putting out on that network of change? Because that has an exponential effect on the people, the inputs, the habits, the inputs, and the mindset, the beliefs, and the values of other people. So if you're mathematically minded, you might think of it of like this equation that we can change culture by changing all of this. We got to change the people, we got to change the practices, we got to change the mindset, and we got to change the way that we dialogue, and we got to change the way that we interact when it comes to culture. Because dialogue and interaction has an exponential power effect on the inputs and the mindset. Now maybe if you're not mathematically minded, you just might think of culture as really it's what's the rules? It's an immaterial process. It's this phenomenon that doesn't consist of like just things and people and behavior, emotions. It does consist of that, but it's how those things are organized. It's the way that they're organized and almost the proportion of those things and the way that they're set up in an organization. It's the shared mental model of people and what the rules are around an organization. It's kind of what you have to know in order to operate and kind of be acceptable to other people. The thing with culture is, I think of it a lot like when you think of all the things that make up an organization, I think of those sometimes as like ingredients. And one thing I've never really understood, I consider myself a pretty good cook and I can make a pretty good meal without following a recipe. But when it comes time to baking, I don't do very well with baking because the ingredients for me don't make sense. That you can have flour and sugar and milk and eggs and butter and salt and baking soda. And it's all the same stuff, whether you make bread or cookies or cake or pastries or whatever. It's all the same ingredients, but it's the different proportion of those ingredients. It's the different relationship between those ingredients that is the difference between if you're making a bread or a muffin or a cake or something or a pie crust. They all have the same stuff, but it's the difference is the way that those things are organized, the way that those ingredients are proportioned in the organization. Organizations all have the same ingredients. They got people, they got processes, they got money, they got rules, they got a building, they got all those same things. What's different about organizations is they all have mindsets, they have beliefs and attitudes, but organization to organization, those beliefs and attitudes and mindsets are different. They're different proportions. Same ingredients, just different proportions. And the dialogue and the interaction is different as well. So from an organizational culture perspective, when we're trying to know our culture and identify our culture and diagnose it and understand it, we have to think of all those immaterial things that make up our culture. So if culture is immaterial and it's kind of ambiguous, how do we know what our culture is? The Organizational Culture Assessment Instrument, or the OCAI, is the way that we identify culture and diagnose culture and understand our culture. So for your homework before our live session together, we want you to assess your organizational culture using the OCAI. You're going to take this instrument, which is going to ask you a whole bunch of questions about your perception of your culture at the place where you work. And you're going to ask to be assigned numerical point values to a bunch of statements. It's important when you take this tool that you answer the questions based on your perception of the place where you work in your own organization. Remember that we talked about culture being the collective sum of everybody's perceptions and habits and things like that. So while you're providing your individual responses and your own organizational culture, everybody else will be doing the same about their organization, and everybody else in your organization could do the same about their perceptions of your culture. So what we would do is assemble all those aggregate results and show you a picture of what your organizational culture looks like based on your perception and everybody else's perception of where you work. So why does the OCAI and culture in general even matter to the state of Wyoming? House Bill 31 requires us to change through implementation of new initiatives. And as we talked about, the success of your new initiative really depends strongly on good implementation. But in turn, your implementation is only good as your culture, and your implementation is really dependent on your culture. That's why we say that culture is king in the leadership curriculum. So the tool helps us measure and change culture so that we get better results with the new implementation. Also, House Bill 31 also requires collaboration across different agencies in the state. And this is where cognitive collaboration and emergenetics helps us. Cognitive collaboration is enacted and engaged by emergenetics. Emergenetics is the vehicle to implement cognitive collaboration. So the OCAI helps us understand our culture, and then cognitive collaboration and emergenetics help us collaborate better. And together, when we put all these together, we get better implementation, better change, better leadership, and better collaboration through all the tools that we'll be giving you.